It's great to be here with you this afternoon. We're going over the book of Daniel, and I'm excited about today's message. When you're a pastor, you're preparing sermons week in, week out, you don't usually intend to make sermons that leave people feeling some kind of way, leave people upset or angry or questioning. Many times I preach a sermon that I think is a really good one. And then someone will meet me at the end, they'll be like, I had an issue with this and blah, blah, blah. And I'll just say, okay, I'll hear them out, and we'll usually talk it through. But this time when I was making the sermon, it's not like I intentionally planned to make it controversial, but I know that there's some things that some folks may have an issue with. I know that coming into it. And now you're probably interested in what is that I'm going to say. Well, this is a good reason for you to listen to what I'm going to say. So you're going to have to pay attention to what I'm talking about and really hear me out, because I don't want you just simply to just hear what I'm saying and accept it just because I'm the pastor, I'm on stage, but I really want you to grapple with what I'm saying and go back to your Bible, go back home and wrestle with what I'm suggesting in the Bible as we look through the narrative of Scripture and see if, just like the Bereans in the book of Acts, if what I'm saying today lines up with what you find yourself reading in the Word of God. Now, I'm going to need one of these things here because I have to go through some things. Okay, so as we have been reading through the book of Daniel, who's been the main character so far? Has it been Daniel? Has it been Nebuchadnezzar? How many people say it's Daniel? How many people say Shadrach? How many people say Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar, okay. I'd say that Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel are the major ones. Now, let me ask you this. Who has been the good guy in the book of Daniel? God. That's a good one. A good one, Ryan. Go ahead, you can say, who's been the good guy? Daniel, right? I mean, is the good guy the one that castrated everyone? Is the good guy the one that almost threatened to kill everyone? I mean, hopefully there's not a lot of ambiguity about who's the good guy here. It's tended to be Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They stood up, they did their thing. But, when I look at the book of Daniel, Daniel is a very important book, not only to us today, but I think to the global audience. Something that's very especially interesting to me is when I read it, is that near the end, in the book of Daniel chapter 12, this is near the end, Daniel is given a message by one of the messengers that's with him. And Daniel is a weird book. I'm going to put it out there, because not only are there like those beasts and there's numbers, there's many things in the beginning, like the historical parts, that are just kind of hard to understand. But near the end, we find that the person that was, or the angel that was with Daniel, explaining him through the last several parts of the vision, he says this about the book. He says, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." So he's basically saying that there are some things in the book of Daniel that when Daniel was writing these things down, they weren't going to make sense. But sometime way in the future, after knowledge shall increase and people running to and fro, they were going to look back on the book, and there would be certain things that weren't clear to Daniel that are going to be made clearer then. Now let me ask you this. Since the time of, let's ballpark this and say 2500 BC, around where Daniel was, around, let's say 1000 BC, because I'm not sure on ancient history, has knowledge increased? You think Daniel would have imagined seeing a plane fly over his head? You think Daniel ever saw the Apollo moon landing? You think Daniel ever saw a car? Think about the technology that was going on in his day. This was the BC. Knowledge has increased today, right? Are people running back and forth? People can go anywhere, like in the blink of an eye. We can be in West Palm Beach in an hour. And how long is West Palm Beach? 6 miles? 60 miles. How long would it take you by horse to get there? Or walking, which is what people did back then. People are running to and fro, and knowledge can increase. So I'd say today, in the world that we live in, at least the conditions are according to what this book says, that it was going to be that at this point in Earth's history, we'd be able to understand a little more about the book of Daniel than we understood back then. Keep that in mind. But it's because of this that I think as we've been looking at the book of Daniel and teaching it, we've been teaching it backwards. It's like riding, hey, that's like backwards. That's right. It's like we're riding a horse, but facing the wrong way. We have taught the last few weeks from the perspective of Daniel and his friends, and we've talked a little about Nebuchadnezzar, but we haven't really understood, in my opinion, that this guy, King Nebuchadnezzar II, is a very important hinge character that if we understood and we understand what his role is and his relationship to who we are, it would help illuminate everything in a little bit clearer manner. Now, let me give a little background to King Nebuchadnezzar. I know that we've been talking about him for the last few weeks, but just to refresh your memory, Nebuchadnezzar was the second king in the dynasty of the Babylonian Empire. His dad, Nabopolassar, was the first king, and he was the second. They came out of the Assyrian Empire, if I'm not mistaken, and he established what was, at that point, one of the greatest nations in the world in that time. He reigned from about 605 to 562 BC. This is the estimates taken from Josephus, which was an ancient historian, Jewish historian. And if you look today, if you Google any sort of idea of who is Daniel or the book of Daniel, what you're going to find is that most scholars are going to say it's fake news, that you shouldn't believe it. Now, I'm not just making this up. If you go to Wikipedia, which I did this week to look up Daniel, what do people say? You'll find at the bottom it says, the portrayal in the Bible, as far as looking at the Bible's portrayal of Nebuchadnezzar, it says at the end that the consensus among modern scholars is that the book of Daniel is historical fiction. So, in other words, fake news, that you can read it and it's nice. It's like an allegory, it's like a fairy tale, but you shouldn't actually look at that and take it like for real, though, because it's a made-up book, basically. And that's the consensus among the people that teach the Bible, okay? That's what they say. I'm going to tell you, I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried about that because there's certain things that, again, if you look at what the book of Daniel said, that near the time of the end, certain things that weren't available for years and years and years were going to be made available. And that you should keep on studying the book of Daniel because you're going to see that things are going to open up. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example real quick. How many of you remember a few weeks ago, this figure in Rio de Janeiro? Or maybe Sao Paulo. Any Brazilians in here? You guys, whoop, whoop. You guys remember that the museum burned down? A priceless museum. It was, I think, the Natural History Museum of Brazil. Burned down overnight. Over 200 years of art, of history, of artifacts burned down to the ground in an instant. Gone. Now, the thing with artifacts, okay, unlike today where you have, oh man, like I was working all night on a paper and I didn't save it, so your work is gone. Yeah, but if you find someone, they might be able to crypto find it or whatever. You can still make a backup of stuff, but you can't make that with history. Like if there's an ancient pot and it's destroyed, it's gone. There's no more of it, right? Unless you find it or find a copy of it later on, but it's easy to find as something on the internet. That's why when they were describing this situation, they described it as a lobotomy on the experience of Brazil, because there's going to be people in the future that they won't be able to. This is dead. Oh, now it's back. Okay. They won't be able. Got it. Thank you. They won't be able to look back and say, I was in Brazil to look at this artifact because it's not there anymore. You see what I'm saying? Now, the book of Daniel has a very interesting artifacts that have come out very recently. So is Nebuchadnezzar fact or fiction? In the 1930s, and Pastor Lafitte mentioned about this recently, 1930s, think about how recent this was. They found the Ishtar Gate, the literal gate that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego would have walked into Babylon in. They would have seen the blue sapphires. They would have seen these lions. And it was lost for years and years until they found it. Now, who's they? The Nazis. The Nazis found it. They put it in Germany. It's still in Berlin. So, I mean, thanks, Nazis, but like, you want to thank them? But they found it. And again, it wasn't there before. It wasn't there before. You need to follow along. This wasn't. So when people are like, oh, the book of Daniel doesn't make sense, you know, the issues of a lion portrayed by Babylon, that doesn't make sense. And they found this in the 30s. And so it's like, oh, okay. Now, the Cyrus cylinder is even more impactful. We're going to talk more about this next week. This was found in 1879. This has certain lines that make direct reference to Cyrus being the one who conquered Babylon over Belteshazzar. He mentions he conquered Babylon from the same line of the Bible. And he says himself, he's like, yeah, I did it. And it was through the power of my God. And we're going to see it next week. And this wasn't there before. So, why do I say this? Is that when I'm preaching today from the book of Daniel, I'm not worrying about like, hey, you know, my friends in school don't believe that's for real, blah, blah. Just wait a second. Let's go through what the book says itself. Because check this out. Let's think about this for a second. If it's true that there is a great controversy, if it's true that there's a devil, right, and he's wanting to fight against God, wouldn't it make sense that he would try to destroy any sort of artifact, any sort of information that corroborates the narrative of the enemy? Right? Information is key. So you'd want to try to disrupt the information that everyone's getting, so be like, nah, we can't trust it. It's fake news. Don't believe Daniel. Don't believe Revelation. Don't believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Don't believe any of it because it's all poisoned. It would make sense if there was actually a war going on for allegiance. That would make sense. But taking this into account, let's just look at the book of Daniel for itself, for its own merits, and see what we can glean from it. As I mentioned in the beginning, we tend to look at the book of Daniel through the eyes of Daniel. We tend to put ourselves in the position of Daniel and say, you know what? Yeah, I think we should all strive to be like Daniel and, you know, be faithful to God and, you know, stand up for what is true, stand up for what is right. And we teach our kids. We've been teaching it the last 3 weeks. It's good. But I want to suggest to you the following. Who are you really? When you look at the book of Daniel, who are you really? Here's something you may not agree with, maybe not. Is that when most Christians aspire, when we look at Daniel, the book of Daniel, we aspire to be like Daniel, but we are actually more like Nebuchadnezzar. When we look at, we want to be like Daniel. We think, yeah, I want to be like Daniel. But when it comes down to it, we're actually more like Nebuchadnezzar. How? I'm going to go through a little recap of what we looked at the last 3 weeks. So these stories may be familiar to you, but think about it as I'm going through them and find out, okay, did Daniel, ask yourself, did Daniel ever mess up, say something out of place, yell, raise his voice, have doubt, lack faith, whatever, in any of these situations? And if you think that's the case, talk to me, let me know. One, the situation of Daniel chapter 1. Daniel goes into Babylon, and he's a eunuch, he's a captive, and he's forced to partake the king's food. And he says, you know, respectfully to one person, can give me a test for 10 days. God prevails, and Daniel's seen as a hero. Did Daniel mess up? No. Okay. Daniel chapter 2. Daniel sees a vision. He's about to get killed with everyone in Babylon, all the magicians, right? And what does he do? Does he get upset? Does he form a revolt? No, he goes and he prays. And then God gives him a dream. He goes to Nebuchadnezzar and he says, King, there is a God in heaven who sees everything. And Nebuchadnezzar says, wow, your God is a true God. He has an experience. Nebuchadnezzar knows that the God of Daniel is the true God because he was able to reveal to Daniel things that even his own magicians weren't able to know. Did Daniel mess up? No. Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 3. Again, remember, did Nebuchadnezzar know who the true God was? You can talk with me, it's okay. Did he know who God was? Yeah, if we look at the end of Daniel chapter 2, which is why, again, I said go through, you can open your Bibles if you want to corroborate what I'm saying. It's right in the beginning. At the end of Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar says, yes, your God is a true God. And he promotes Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to very high positions of power in the cabinet. And so he's like, yeah, because you guys got it. You guys have the spirit of the Most High God in you. So, actually going back, it's interesting to connect the dates too. Daniel 1, Daniel was about 15, 16 years old. Nebuchadnezzar was about 47, thereabouts. Again, I'm taking these dates from Josephus. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar is 48 years old, and Daniel is 16, 17. It's about a year later. Daniel chapter 3 takes place years later when Daniel's 23 years old, thereabouts, and King Nebuchadnezzar is 54 years old. Did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego mess up here? Did they ever say something wrong? Nebuchadnezzar. He knew about the golden statue, right? So you knew why he made the whole statue out of gold. Why? Because Daniel told him in Daniel 2 that you are the head of gold. So he's like, okay, the whole statue is made of gold. So again, we're finding a pattern of Daniel and his friends never messing up. King Nebuchadnezzar, in now Daniel chapter 4, this is now years and years later, specifically 16 years, listen to me, 16 years after Daniel 2. Daniel 2 was, again, the story, the dream he couldn't remember. In Daniel 4, 16 years later, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And this time, Daniel's about 33 years old, Nebuchadnezzar is 64 years old, and he has a dream. And I will go into this one here, because this is where we're going to be basing our study today off of. Daniel chapter 4 says Nebuchadnezzar was in his house, and it was flourishing in his palace. And it's written in the first person as a first-person prologue. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. How many of the wise men? Okay, we're following. He brought all of the wise men into his presence to try to interpret the dream. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. So this guy literally brought who? Everybody that he could think of to interpret the dream to him, but no one could interpret it. Now, you feel like you're getting a little bit of deja vu here? When you're reading this? Like, did Nebuchadnezzar forget that Daniel was who he was? I doubt it. Why? Because here we find a very key sentence. He says this in red, but finally Daniel came before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my gods, and in whom the spirit in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. So he knew that Daniel had palanca, he had weight, he was able to discern things. And he says to him, O Belteshazzar, chief of the... So who was Daniel? He was the chief of the musicians, but he was the chief of the magicians. So you would think that the first person you would call would be Daniel. But instead, the last person he calls is Daniel. Daniel should be the first person, because again, it's like you don't forget Daniel too. But 16 years later, the last person he decides to go with is Daniel. Why is that? Why would that be? Why would that be the case? I'm going to let you sit with that for a second. But again, as I'm looking through the first 4 books of Daniel Revelation, I realize that really we aspire to be like Daniel, but we're more like Nebuchadnezzar. How many times in those 4 books did you ever see Daniel messing up? 0. None. Nebuchadnezzar is given this dream by Daniel, who's obviously able to interpret it for him. And he gives him the interpretation of the dream. And the dream essentially is that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. There's this big tree, huge tree, and it's covering the whole world. At some point, there's something that cuts the tree down, and the tree falls down, and there's like the trunk of it. And the trunk still has this kind of metal band that holds the tree together. And there was a dream that he interprets as like 7 times we're going to pass over the tree, but then afterwards the tree was going to get better again. And he was like, Daniel, what does this mean? And Daniel says, the Bible says that Daniel sits down and does one of these things. He's like, or you know that meme when the guy's like, he does that, essentially, because, and it says he had a look of concern on his face, because he's like, King, you're that tree. I hate to tell you, but you're that tree. God is seeing your kingdom, and he's seeing that you're not measuring up to certain things, and you're mistreating the poor. You have pride. You have ego. Unless you can fix this, God says he's going to take your kingdom away from you, and you're going to be basically out eating grass for 7 periods. Some have interpreted it to be 7 years, 7 weeks. The point is that it says his nails were going to grow long like an ox, and his beard was going to get strangly, and his hair was going to grow like the feathers of an eagle. Like he wasn't going to take care of himself. He's just going to be like this mindless, grass-eating cow for 7 years. And so after 7 years, Daniel interprets his dream. And what we find later on in the same book, Daniel chapter 4, verse 28 says the following: all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 12 months. So God gives him a little bit of a reprieve, gives a little bit of space for a year to see if he could fix his act, to see if he could go back to change his ways. But Nebuchadnezzar finds himself in an interesting location. He says at 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. And the king said to himself, he said this, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty. It was a beautiful day in Babylon. Like today, he looked over the Key Biscayne area. He looked at it, he's like, man, this is nice. This is what I've built. And it's at this moment that a voice from heaven calls out and says, I'm really paraphrasing, but says, nope. You remember that dream I told you about a year ago? It's going to happen. Your kingdom has been taken away from you. And immediately, Nebuchadnezzar was taken out of Babylon, and he was basically turned into a cow for 7 years. Now, what are some of the pronouns that you see here? I, my. So the focus is really on what? He was on himself. He was like, yeah, it's about me. I'm looking at what I've been able to accomplish in this kingdom that I've been able to establish. Now, would you agree with the following statements? Would you agree that he said, I'm rich? Would you agree with that he said, I have everything I want? Would you agree that he was thinking to himself, I don't need a thing? He's like, he was good. And at this point, if you're following, you may be saying, no, I got you, Pastor. You said that we were more like Nebuchadnezzar, but you said he's rich and I'm not rich. So, sorry, I'm not you. Okay, all right, let's get there. Let me ask you this. How much money do you think it would take to be part of the world's richest 1%? Income. How much money do you think you'd have to make a year in order to be part of the global 1%? Give me an idea. Global. And a few years ago, we had this thing, March on Wall Street, 1%. I'm not talking about 1% in America, 1% in Miami. Okay? I'm talking about 1% in the whole world. 15,000? A lot of zeros? Okay. Anyone want to say $1 million? Anyone want to say more? About $100 a month? So about $1,200 a year? Okay. There was an article that came out recently in Investopedia a month ago asking how much does it take to be part of the global 1%, income-wise, making a year. And they said that it would take you an income of $32,400 a year to be in the global 1%. Income. If you're making more than 32,400, you make more than 99% of people on the planet. You know, really? You guys seem really comfortable with this information. Like you guys knew this. Because I told this to the first service, they were like, no, it's not possible. And I'm like, no, guys, like, I'm not talking about Miami because it's hard to get by in Miami. Yes, it's like, you kidding me? 1% in Miami? That doesn't buy anything in Miami. Okay, I'm talking about the world. How many people are there in the world? Like billions of people, right? 6? You know how many there are in India? A lot more in Miami. If you have more than 2 pairs of shoes, if you have a car, if you have more than 3 pairs of clothes, 3 changes of clothes, you are part of the global 1% of income. I'm not talking about just Miami. I'm talking about the world. You guys seem really cool with this, so good. I don't have to convince you about this. All right, rich folks, I see us 1%ers. 1%ers. So Nebuchadnezzar was rich. He was in, because I'm part of 1% too. If I could, we're all in this together. I don't have everything I need. And you know what's interesting about this specifically? I actually didn't just make up these words. Because you know that these words are actually found somewhere else. It connects later on in the Bible to the last book of the Bible, in the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation says something very fascinating. In the book of Revelation chapter 3, there's a group of people who say, I am rich. I have everything I need, and I don't need a thing. And you don't realize that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. I'm sure Jesus is talking to the pagans or the Pharisees in this one, right? You know who he's talking to? It's called the seven churches. See, there were these seven churches in Asia Minor that he was talking to. And the last church, which we have interpreted to be the churches, the last church right before the second coming, this is a group that says that they have everything they need. That was Jesus talking to them, saying that you say you're rich, you have everything you need nothing. But Jesus is telling them, no, your condition is that you're miserable, you're poor, you're blind, you're naked, you're not even hot, you're not even cold. You guys are just coming week after week, and you're like, meh. And that's actually what it says in the Greek, except that the word is lukewarm. Lukewarm isn't hot. Like, I burned myself today. This morning, I was making some tea, and I hit myself on and my wife did it, but whatever. It was a mistake. You know, my elbow, and it was hot. And I was like, it was hot. My son loves taking baths in cold water for some reason now. That's good for me. Saves on water. But he's like, oh, cold, cold, cold. But Jesus says, you're not even hot or cold. You're just meh. You're lukewarm. Your faith isn't hot. You're chilling. You say you're rich. You say you have everything you need, and that's not the case. Now, this is important for us to pay attention to, because later on in the book of Revelation chapter 17 and 18, there's another kind of parallel figure that we call Babylon. And Babylon, we're going to study more about this next 2 months. We're going to spend a while unpacking Revelation. But there's this beast with different composite heads. And it's fascinating because a lot of the same symbology, a lot of the same things that the beast in Revelation has is a composite of all of the weird stuff we read in Daniel. So there's like lions and there's bears. There's no tigers, but there's like an eagle. There's a leopard. And in the Revelation, there's a lot of combination we see in the book of Daniel, and it comes again in Revelation. And there's a woman, and we tend to, well, I'll get there. Babylon is seen as this powerful figure, as this force that is like an antithesis to what God's trying to do. And God tells the people in Babylon, he's calling his people in Revelation chapter 18. He tells the people that are in Babylon, he says, come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. So God has people in Babylon. Now, let's go back to Daniel. Was Nebuchadnezzar God's man? Was he someone that believed in God? Was he someone that had experienced God in his life? Was he someone that had seen the Son of God in the fire? He was God's man. We're following, okay? We tend to think of Babylon simply as a false system of worship, and it can mean that, but it is also seen as self-sufficient systemic thinking. Because again, Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of the palace, and at the moment that he was like, man, isn't this the Babylon that I've created? He wasn't, no worship in a sense, but he was just looking and just like, man, pride, that is, I did this. This is nice. I've been able to find what I'm looking for. It's at this moment that God intervenes and says, nope, you're not in charge. You're going to be made a cow for 7 years until you realize who is in charge, that God in heaven oversees the world. It's at that moment. Now, follow me now. We talked about Revelation, and we talked about Daniel. We talked about Babylon. And it's interesting that the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, needed to come out of Babylon. So the same message that God's giving to the book of Revelation, the church in the book of Revelation, is the same, you could say, the same problem that King Nebuchadnezzar had is the same problem that the church of Laodicea has. That they're rich, they're increased for wants, they need nothing. And the same solution that God prescribed for Nebuchadnezzar is the same solution he's telling the church in Revelation chapter 17 to come out of Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar literally needed to go out of Babylon. Now here's where the heresy comes in. So once we look at Babylon from this perspective of more than just ways of worshiping, It's a systemic thinking that says, yeah, everything relies on me. I've done this. Look at what I've created. This is nice. We can get really comfortable in the boxes that we make. We can get really comfortable in the things that we help to think about and to create and formulate. And in some ways, Babylon can find its sufficiency in its institutions, in its theology, in its structure, in its buildings, in its policy, in its thinking, in its tradition, in its culture. It can say, yeah, isn't this what we've created? Isn't this nice? And you'll ride into the sunset thinking this is going to be nice. Now, the heresy is this. Because I grew up in the church, the Seventh-day Adventist church. My dad was a member of another denomination. But when we were coming in, we were taught certain things that 17 and 18 talk about the systems of worship. And we look at the powers that exist in other people. And even early Adventism, the way that we taught the book of Daniel and Revelation, we taught that the beast and the woman of Babylon and her daughters subsequently later were three things. Do you know what they were? You may, maybe not. We taught in some of the earliest visions of Daniel and Revelation, we taught that paganism, that the papacy, and that Protestantism were Babylon and were basically lost. That those were the people that needed to come out. Now you see where the danger in this is, though. Why? Because you know what the problem is? The problem is everybody else out there, all those other churches that are keeping Sunday, those are the wrong people. Those are the confused ones. Those are Babylon. But you leave Babylon and you come to the remnant, you're good. Am I talking to somebody? You're good in our church. And the finger was pointed at other people rather than at ourselves. It's easy for us to say, oh, yeah, those people have all the problems because look at the institutions that they're doing, whatever. And yet we come to church every Saturday sitting pretty and our lives are just meh. Our faith is meh. We don't have anything to share about how good Jesus has been because it's just another Sabbath. And yet we think we're acting like the remnant because at least we're not worshiping on Sunday. No. No. So there'll be pastors that will go to churches and they'll say, well, we are churches that act like this. We told the incoming pastor that we're a church with a desire to grow, but as long as it doesn't mean change or new people or someone sitting in my pew or different music and worship or this or that or the other. And they'll say, no, churches that don't want to change, that's Babylonic thinking. Because they'll say, I'm good where I'm at. Don't push me out of my comfort zone because I want to be where I'm at. My box is nice. Don't make me go outside of my comfort zone. And unless you're thinking, well, Pastor, hold on a second. You're saying that theology, we have our 28 fundamental beliefs. What are you saying? Well, since some people won't believe what I have to say unless it comes from Ellen White, she said this. As a people, we are certainly in great danger if we are not constantly guarded of considering our ideas because long cherished to be biblical doctrines and on every point infallible and measuring everyone by the rule of our interpretation of Bible truth. We're in danger of thinking that we have the correct theology because everyone looks at it this way. There's no other way to look at it. And if you don't look at it this way, then guess what? You're part of the problem. There's a danger in that because it puts self at what we've been able to understand at the pedestal. And it's at that point that we're in danger of that Babylonic thinking that got Nebuchadnezzar in danger. Now, there's someone else that says something similar to this. Is Blaise Pascal. He's a philosopher, Christian philosopher. He said this: if we do not know ourselves to be full of pride, ambition, lust, weakness, misery, and injustice, we are indeed blind. And if knowing this, we do not desire deliverance, what can we say of a man? If we don't realize that we have problems, if we don't realize that we have issues, if we don't realize that we need a Savior, then man, we really are messed up. So if you're hearing me today and you're saying, Pastor, okay, that's great, but I'm doing pretty good. I really don't need that. Praise the Lord, man. I'll say great, but there may be a church in Laodicea we might want to move your membership transfer to. Because everyone here at Miami Temple, we have issues. We have problems with self. So let's go back and look at the book of Daniel through the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar. So in the book of Daniel chapter 1, it is God prevailing with Nebuchadnezzar. Have we ever as a church or individual issued test of fellowships on others? Said that you're not a real Adventist unless you don't have a beard. Which is true. That was policy at one point. And now our General Conference president wants people to wear beards. People got in trouble for not wearing ties in church. People got kicked out of churches for not wearing skirts that were long enough. Have we ever made tests of fellowships to other people? So our experience is like Nebuchadnezzar a little bit. Even in our church, in our lives. Have we ever been worried about the future of our kingdom, individually, in your family? Have you been worried about what's going to happen to your family? Worried about the future? How are you going to make everything work? If your retirement's going to add up to the end of the day when you want to retire, are you worried about what happens next? Have we as a church been worried about that? I can say yes, and I know this personally because I literally wrote the article on this. I did. With the North American division, myself with the ministerial department, we talked about, and this is a small side note, of an impending pastoral shortage that's going to happen. I don't know how the Inter-American division is, but for the North American division, within the next 3 or 4 years, more than 50% of our pastors and administrators are going to be at or near retirement age. They're going to be retiring. And it's going to be a bubble, just like, remember the housing market pop, right? To put it this way, there's not going to be enough pastors graduating from seminary and undergraduate to fill all of the church positions and administrative positions that are going to be available. There's literally not going to be enough. So we're looking for a third pastor right now, and we better hope we find one because the more time passes, it's going to be harder to find local pastors and churches. And I wrote the article on this. You're welcome. And we do worry about the future. We are worrying about this. And I'll get to that later on. Have we been in a situation or a church or institution, denomination, or individually where we can use threats and force and intimidation to gain compliance from others? In our church, I know pastors whose their checks were withheld, the money that they used to feed their families every week, unless they were able to sell a certain amount of magazines in their church. In gathering. That's what it was. Pastors literally couldn't put food on the table because they said you have to sell certain things in order to be able to get money to feed your family. This was God's church. Now, I'm not saying that the church is Babylon. We're going to be talking a little bit more about this later on. But you'd be foolish to think that Babylon and the remnant, that kind of thinking can't and does exist in the same place at the same time. The way Jesus called it was the wheat and the tares. They were both in the same place at the same time. And we're not talking about institutions. We're talking about people. We can even have the same kind of thinking in ourselves. We can sometimes want to follow God in one breath, and in another breath, do things that are totally antithetical to what God's asking for us in our lives. So what I'm saying to you is I can relate more to Nebuchadnezzar than to Daniel, because he relates to my experience. Nebuchadnezzar needed, after 16 years, he had an experience that he should have realized, oh, I'm going to go to Daniel. Duh, obviously Daniel's the one that can solve dreams. But he didn't. He waited. And how many times in our experience we go through, we look for every single avenue. We try to find every solution to the problem. And then after everything has been exhausted, then we go to God. That experience sounds a lot like my experience. I don't know about yours, but this describes me to a T. We cannot, as a church, force or try to get others to believe in Jesus through policy or compliance. Ellen White said this: the church may pass down resolution upon resolution to put down all disagreement of opinions, but we cannot force the mind and the will and thus root out disagreement. These resolutions may conceal the discord, but they cannot quench it and establish perfect agreement. Nothing can perfect unity in the church but the spirit of Christ-like forbearance. So there's something about Jesus that himself will fix everything. There's something about Jesus that in your life, if you're finding what's that missing thing, ask yourself, have you been trying to find the solution in everything else that you've been able to put into solution instead of taking a step back and saying, okay, God, I'm ready to receive what you have for me. So I go back to the question, who are you really? Are you more like Daniel, who always stood up for right and never messed up, who always stood up for truth and principle, Or you're like Nebuchadnezzar, a rich person, maybe knowing it, maybe not knowing it, but realizing that you've been working and basically relying on your own skills, your gifts, your ability, your smart talk, and your good looks, whatever. Sorry. And then God's saying, hold on, man, you're bald. Take a step back. You don't realize that you're miserable, you're short, you're blind, you're naked. You see, I'm personalizing this. I need God in my life. I really do. Because if I let myself go, I can be like Nebuchadnezzar. I can. Now, here's the gospel concept. How would you explain the gospel in a sentence? In one sentence, what does the gospel mean to you? So, the gospel is, the good news of Jesus Christ, how he came. But what does it mean to you personally? I sent this question off on Facebook, and I got a lot of different responses. Some people said like similar things, and they said love, and they said, this is some of the responses. Love, and Jesus wins. Love of God, no fear, freedom. I will never earn it, and I never have to, but he gifted salvation to me without merit. To love God and love others, that Jesus saved you, that you have new life in Jesus. I like this one at the end, that God looks like Jesus and that Jesus is God. Every person described the gospel differently. Why? Because that's a personal experience. God's relationship with you is different than the relationship he has with me. And what brings you into Jesus and what makes you fall in love with him is different than what makes me fall in love with him. And that's okay. And for Nebuchadnezzar, and it's important for us to understand what the gospel to Nebuchadnezzar might have meant, because it may mean something for us. And it's this, that Nebuchadnezzar and our greatest challenge was to accept God's sovereignty over his life. To realize that it can't be all about you. It can't be all about what makes you feel good and what makes you comfortable. That I come here and I'm doing this as long as it doesn't require any sort of commitment. We think either too little of ourselves or we think way too highly of ourselves. And each our problem. Thinking you're too little undermines what God sees in you. Thinking too much of yourself is dumb. Don't do that. God doesn't want either of those because that doesn't help you out. What he wants is for you to realize that you're his child. And that child, really, you're a child, so you have to depend on your father. Stop relying on yourself. Stop relying on your talents or your intellect and your ability to plan and to reason and talk your way out through things. Start relying on the Holy Spirit. Start relying on God's ability to keep you from the challenge that you face. God's not going to stop you from experiencing trials and challenges, but he will be with you in there, just like Daniel was. So who is Daniel in the book of Revelation? Daniel. I want to propose to you, Daniel is like Jesus. He's a messianic figure who, like Jesus, in this case, he never messes up, at least that we know of. That he was humiliated, that he was in a lowly position, and he constantly relied on his father for the answers, for the experiences. And here he comes to Nebuchadnezzar, relying on Daniel relying on his connection with the Father, and Nebuchadnezzar sometimes very grudgingly at the end of it all saying, okay, Daniel, what do you think, man? When Daniel revealed himself at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's life and the whole way through, Nebuchadnezzar should have said, okay, Daniel, first person, what do I do? How do I take care of this? He already made Daniel the head of the chief of magicians. And even 16 years later, the last person he was going to was Daniel. How many of us, even though we know about Jesus, we've been walking with Jesus for years and years and years, he's not the first person we call to when we have a problem. It's usually us. My experience is more like Nebuchadnezzar's, not like Daniel's. So, Nebuchadnezzar finally experiences this. And we'll finish with this. 3 minutes and we're done. After all of this, Daniel could say to himself, Nebuchadnezzar had this aha moment. He came out of this stupor that he was in. And he said, at the end of this time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to the heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever with these words. For his kingdom is an everlasting dominion. And his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will with the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? This is the king of Babylon, realizing that once he experienced that humility that can come with understanding who God is in his life, he was able to say, basically like the Apostle Paul, that God can do all things through he who gives me strength. And at the same time, his reason was restored, his glory was restored to him, and he had basically everything he lacked before. But one thing I find fascinating are the two sentences at the end, is that now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride, he is able to put down. God is able to put down our pride. And if you don't think he can, just wait. So, what's the moral of this? Is that the answer isn't more knowledge. We've been reading the book of Revelation, Daniel, backwards. We've been starting with the beasts and with the nations and with the charts and with the prophecies. But what Nebuchadnezzar was lacking wasn't information. It wasn't even a relationship because he had that. He required humility. He needed to submit himself every day of his life. But in order for that to happen, you have to have an experience with God. You have to realize that God is bigger than your past, than your depression, than your pain, than your hate, than your anger, than your doubt, than your fear, than your shame, than your anxiety, than your scars. God is bigger than the world. You need to have that understanding that God is much bigger than anything you can ever hope, that whatever keeps you from getting to know him, those are all made-up inventions in your mind, things that if you really were to try him out, you would say, oh, I get it. And I'll finish with this. People usually come to our churches every week to meet God, but unfortunately, sometimes they just meet us. Ask yourself this week, what can you do? What can we do to get ourselves out of the way so that people can have an encounter with God? In this case, the person who may need to have an encounter with God might just be you. So as it says in the book of Daniel, he who has ears, let him hear.